You know, there's this really specific phenomenon in history. I kind of call it the Margle Trap.
A marble trap.
We take these absolutely revolutionary, complicated, sometimes messy human beings, and we freeze them in stone. We memorize a few lines from a speech. We name a holiday after them, a few street signs.
And in doing that, you lose the person.
You strip them of their actual humanity. And I think for most of us, Martin Luther King Jr. is the ultimate victim of that marble trap.
Oh, absolutely. It's the stained glass window effect. We revere the image, but we lose the man. And you're right, with King, that effect is massive. You close your eyes, you see the Lincoln Memorial, you hear, I have a dream.
You think, okay, I know this story. He was the peace guy. He fixed it.
Right. Story is over.
Exactly. And that is why I am genuinely excited about the stack of sources we've pulled for this deep dive. We are trying to break that marble. We're not looking at the sanitized holiday version of King.
No.
We're going back to the National Archives findings on his assassination. We're looking at personal letters, historical records on his final and honestly very chaotic campaign.
And some fascinating comparative essays on him and Malcolm X. Our mission here is really to uncover the man who was originally named Michael, not Martin.
I think people forget that.
A man who, by the end of his life, wasn't just marching. He was building a literal tent city on the National Mall that had its own zip code. He was radicalizing in ways that history books often just, conveniently leave out.
And we're going to tackle the heavy stuff, too. The FBI files, the surveillance, and all those conspiracy theories around his death that just won't go away. So buckle up. We are stripping away the myth to find the man.
Let's dive in.
I want to start with something that I think a lot of people just gloss over, or maybe they treat it as a trivia fact, but it seems so fundamental to who he became. He wasn't born Martin Luther King Jr.
No, he was not. He was born Michael King. And his father was Michael King Sr. For the first 5 years of his life, the civil rights icon we know was just Little Mike.
Little Mike.
The name change didn't happen at birth. It happened because of a trip that completely changed his father's life.
This is the 1934 trip to Germany, right? This part absolutely blew my mind.
Right. Now, context is critical here. It's 1934, King Sr., Daddy King. He travels to Berlin for a Baptist World Alliance meeting.
And you have to think about what is happening in Germany in 1934.
Exactly. Hitler is chancellor. The Nazis are consolidating power. You have this atmosphere of totalitarianism rising, flags everywhere, a demand for total submission.
And here's this black Baptist preacher from the American South walking right through the middle of Berlin. I mean, that contrast is so stark.
It's incredibly stark. He's seeing the ominous signs of fascism, which must have resonated, with what he saw back home in the Jim Crow South. The oppression looked different, but the smell of it was the same. But while he's there, he visits the sites associated with the great German reformer, Martin Luther.
The man who started the Protestant Reformation?
The man who nailed his 95 Theses to the church door and basically said, I will not accept the authority of this institution because my conscience tells me otherwise.
Yeah.
It was the ultimate act of protest against absolute power.
So it's connecting the spiritual with the political right there.
Precisely. And King Sr. was so moved by the history of that protest tradition and so disturbed by the rise of Nazism that when he came home, he didn't just tell a story about it. He changed his identity.
He changed his own name to Martin Luther King, and then he changed his 5-year-old son's name too.
Yep.
That is such a heavy burden to put on a 5-year-old. You're not just naming him after yourself anymore. You're naming him after this global symbol of defiance.
It was a statement. It was a symbolic link to a tradition of protest. It effectively said to the world, we are protesters by name and by nature. I mean, it set the trajectory for his son's entire life.
And looking at the sources on King Sr., it seems like that defiance was something he modeled every single day. It wasn't just in the name. There's that famous story about the shoe shop that really illustrates this.
It's a classic,
Yeah.
but it reveals so much about the domestic education of MLK Jr. King Sr. takes his son to buy shoes in Atlanta. They sit in the front of the store on the comfortable seats. A white clerk comes over.
And tells them to move to the back?
I need you boys to move to the back seats, which was, standard procedure. Most people, even if they hated it, they'd just move to avoid a scene, especially with a child there.
Right.
But King Sr. looked at the clerk and said, we'll either buy shoes sitting here or we won't buy any shoes at all. And he grabbed little Mike's hand and just walked out.
Wow.
King Jr. later said it was the first time he ever saw his father truly furious. He told his son, I don't care how long I have to live with this system, I will never accept it.
There's another anecdote that really stuck with me, the traffic stop. This one feels so visceral.
Oh, this one is pivotal. A police officer pulls him over. Now, in that era, A police stop for a black man could be lethal. The officer walks up and addresses King Sr. as boy. He says, "Let me see your license, boy."
Which is about as demeaning as it gets for a grown man, a community leader. It's designed to strip away all his authority.
Exactly. And King Sr., he just points to his son in the passenger seat. He looks the officer in the eye and says, "That is a boy. I am a man, and until you call me one, I will not listen to you."
That is incredibly risky. I mean, for a black man in the South in the 30s or 40s, people got killed for less than that.
Extremely risky. But think about the impact on the child watching that. You are seeing your father demand dignity in a world that is legally structured to deny it.
So when we analyze King Jr.'s later resistance, we can understand it wasn't just intellectual. It wasn't just something he learned from Gandhi.
No, it was in his DNA. It was models for him before he could even spell segregation.
So you have this foundation of defiance. He grows up, takes the mantle, and eventually lands in a jail cell in Birmingham. And he writes the letter from Birmingham jail. I think most of us read this in high school, and we remember it as, a general plea for civil rights.
It is a plea, but if you really read it closely, which we did for this deep dive, it's actually a stinging rebuke.
Yeah.
And the surprise is who he's aiming at.
Yeah.
He isn't writing this to the KKK. He isn't writing it to the George Wallaces of the world. He knows where they stand.
No, he's going after the white moderate.
Correct. He writes that he is gravely disappointed with the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice. The person who says, "I agree with your goal, but I can't agree with your methods. Why can't you just wait?"
That distinction between order and justice is so sharp. He talks about negative peace versus positive peace. I found that fascinating.
It's a brilliant philosophical distinction. He says the white moderate wants negative peace, which is just the absence of tension. It's quiet, no protests, no disruption. But King argues that's just the silence of oppression. Positive peace is the presence of justice. And sometimes, to get positive peace, you have to create tension. You have to lance the boil, to use his metaphor.
I think that resonates so much today. We still hear people say, "I support the cause, but do you have to be so disruptive?" King is basically answering from 1963, saying, yes, because your comfort is shielding the injustice.
And he backs it up with moral philosophy. He distinguishes between just laws and unjust laws. He says a just law uplifts human personality. An unjust law degrades it.
So segregation statutes are inherently unjust.
Because they degrade the human soul, they damage the segregated and the segregator, so they are unjust. Therefore, you don't just have a right to disobey them, you have a moral responsibility to disobey them.
There's also this incredible section about time, the idea that time heals all wounds.
King calls that a tragic misconception. He argues that time is neutral. It's just a container. It doesn't fix things on its own.
He wrote, "Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability."
Exactly. It requires work. Basically, he says that the people of ill will are often using time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. If you just wait, things don't get better, they rot.
Now, while King is refining this philosophy in the South, there's this counter-narrative rising in the North.
Malcolm X.
And the source material here does a great job of contrasting them without, falling into the trap of making them cartoon enemies.
It's so easy to paint them as opposites. Martin, the peaceful integrator, Malcolm, the fiery separatist. But you have to look at the soil they grew in.
Right.
King, as we discussed, grew up in the South in a loving middle-class family, surrounded by a strong black community and the church. He had a safety net.
Whereas Malcolm X's origin story is just a horror story by comparison.
Malcolm grew up in the North, but his reality was poverty and violence. His father was murdered, likely by white supremacists. His mother was institutionalized. He was a ward of the state. He saw the northern brand of racism.
Which wasn't whites only signs at the water fountain?
No, it was colder. It was insidious. It was economic exclusion, police brutality, the welfare system destroying families.
So their strategies come from completely different life experiences.
Completely. When Malcolm talks about self-defense and black nationalism, it's coming from a place of raw survival. King believed the moral conscience of America could be awakened because he'd seen glimpses of humanity in the South. Malcolm X, having seen the cold indifference of the liberal North, was skeptical that white America had a conscience to awaken.
But the fascinating takeaway from these essays is that toward the end of their lives, they were actually moving toward each other.
They were converging. Their ultimate goal was always the same: dignity and human rights. But King started to realize that integration wasn't enough without economic equity, and Malcolm started to broaden his view on cooperation. They were meeting in the middle.
Which leads us perfectly to the end of King's life. The pivot. We tend to focus on 1963 and the Dream Speech, but by 67, 68, King is in a very different headspace.
This is the chapter that often gets skipped in the history books because it's uncomfortable.
It is.
He moves from civil rights to human rights. He starts focusing intensely on economic justice. He famously said, "What good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger?"
And this scares people. This is where he stops being just a racial reformer and starts sounding like a class warrior.
Absolutely. He launches the Poor People's Campaign, and the radical part was the coalition. He wasn't just calling for black people. He was organizing poor whites, Hispanics, Native Americans. He wanted to build a class-based coalition to storm Washington.
He called it a bloodless war on poverty.
He did. And there's a specific moment that sparked this intensity, right? Trip to Mississippi.
Yes, Marks, Mississippi in 1968. He visited a daycare center. The source describes him watching the children eat lunch.
And he realized that they were sharing a single slice of an apple and some crackers. That was the whole meal. King was just moved to tears. He had to step outside to compose himself.
And that was it.
He decided right then that the Yule Train, one of the caravans of the campaign, would start right there in Marks.
So the plan was to go to D.C. and not just march for a day. They wanted to occupy the city.
They built Resurrection City on the National Mall. I mean, imagine this today. In May of '68, they set up thousands of A-frame tents between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. It wasn't a campsite, it was a functioning town.
A functioning town.
It had a dining hall, a soul tent for cultural events, a psychiatrist, a city hall, its own police force. It literally had its own zip code. 2013.
A zip code on the National Mall. That is wild. But the reality of living there, the sources paint a pretty grim picture. This was not Woodstock.
Not at all. It was grueling. It rained constantly. The sources describe 5 inches of standing water and mud everywhere. People were getting sick. Morale was just tanking. And on top of the weather, you had the government breathing down their necks.
This is where we get into the assassination files territory and the FBI, because the government wasn't just watching, they were active.
Active and terrified. The SBI launched Operation PooCam, short for Poverty Campaign, specifically to disrupt this. They spread rumors that if people went to D.C., their welfare checks would be cut off back home. They were genuinely afraid this coalition of the poor would turn into a violent revolution.
And eventually the police did clear the camp.
It ended in a cloud of tear gas. King had been assassinated just weeks before the campaign fully kicked off, so Ralph Abernathy was trying to lead this massive, chaotic city in a time of national grief. The police moved in, evicted everyone, and bulldozed the structures.
So it's often viewed as a failure?
At the time, yes, it felt like a defeat. But, and this is important, it wasn't a total failure. The pressure they created directly led to expansions in the food stamp program and school lunches. That apple and cracker lunch King saw. The campaign helped change that reality for millions of kids.
You mentioned King was killed before the campaign really took hold. We have to talk about the assassination. I feel like every few years a new theory pops up. The FBI did it, the Memphis police did it.
Yeah.
But we have the findings from the National Archives here. Let's look at the hard evidence.
Let's clear the air. The National Archives investigation looked specifically at the allegations of government complicity.
Okay, the big one. Did the FBI kill Martin Luther King? We know J. Edgar Hoover hated him. We know about the surveillance.
The findings are nuanced. They confirm absolutely that COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, was active and hostile. They were trying to discredit him, harass him, wiretap him. That is a historical fact.
But
However, the archives found no evidence that the FBI plotted to assassinate him or hired a hitman.
what about the setup? I've heard people say the FBI forced him to stay at the Lorraine Motel because it was an easy target with that balcony.
That is one of the most persistent myths. The investigation showed that King stayed at the Lorraine by personal choice and habit. It was a black-owned motel. It was where he felt comfortable. It's where he always stayed in Memphis.
But there was that memo, right? A document that said handled regarding his hotel.
Yes, and conspiracy theorists latch onto this. There was an FBI memo with a note saying handled next to the hotel information. But in intelligence speak, handled likely just meant the information had been filed, or that they decided not to leak a negative story about his accommodation. It didn't mean we are handling his location for a hit. It was paperwork.
Okay, what about the police? This is the one that always looks suspicious to me. The removal of security. Specifically, the black detective, Edward Reddit.
This is a complex story that gets simplified. Reddit was a black detective conducting surveillance on King from a fire station across the street. 2 hours before the shooting, he was removed from his post and sent home.
Which looks incredibly suspicious. Get the witness out of the way.
Visually, yes, it looks terrible. But the archives dig into why. A threat had been received against a black lieutenant in the Memphis PD. The police brass claimed they removed Reddit for his own safety because of that specific threat.
So it wasn't to clear the view for a shooter.
The evidence suggests it was a standard, albeit clumsy, protective measure for their own officer. There were also black firemen transferred from that station. Conspiracy theorists say it was to remove friendly eyes. The record shows those firemen were actually transferred at Reddit's own request because he felt they were compromising his surveillance cover.
He thought they were blowing his spot.
He thought they were blowing his spot.
So the conclusion of the files.
James Earl Ray acted alone. He was not aided by the FBI or the police. However, the report does slam the Memphis police for gross negligence. They had no contingency plan to seal off the city. That incompetence allowed Ray to escape. It wasn't a grand conspiracy. It was a lack of preparation.
It's often less satisfying, isn't it? We want this grand villainous plot, but often history just turns on a lone actor and institutional incompetence.
Exactly. We want it to be a massive plot because the man was massive. It feels wrong that a petty criminal like Ray could take down a giant like King. But I think focusing on the conspiracy distracts from the tragedy of the loss and the work that was left unfinished.
Which brings us to his legacy. And you cannot talk about his legacy without talking about the person who actually built it, Coretta Scott King.
We absolutely have to mention her. The Guardian source makes a powerful point. She was not a symbol, but an activist. We tend to see her as the grieving widow in the veil. But days after Martin was killed, she was in Memphis. She led the march he was supposed to lead.
That takes an incredible amount of strength to step into those shoes while you're still in shock.
She continued the work of the Poor People's Campaign. She was the one who lobbied for the holiday. She was the architect of his legacy. Without Coretta, we probably don't have the king we know today. She made sure the world didn't forget.
And looking back at the I Have a Dream speech, we talked about how we freeze him in that moment. But why that speech? Why did that one stick when he gave thousands of others?
Well, it's a masterclass in rhetoric, sure.
Yeah.
The source highlights his use of anaphora, that rhythmic repetition of phrases, I have a dream, I have a dream. It hits the ear like music. It builds momentum.
But the strategy was brilliant.
The strategic genius was how he framed it. He didn't frame the civil rights struggle as a radical break from America.
He framed it as the fulfillment of it.
Exactly. He anchored it in the Declaration of Independence. He basically said, you wrote this promissory note. We are just here to cash it. He made it impossible for a patriot to disagree with him without contradicting their own history. He didn't say burn it down. He said live up to what you wrote down.
That is such a key insight. But I want to end with a thought that brings us back to that letter from the jail. Because for all the soaring rhetoric of the dream speech, King had a very grounded, almost haunting fear.
Yes, the fear of silence. He wrote that in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. He was arguably more afraid of the polite silence of good people than he was of the burning crosses.
That hits home. It's so easy to look back at 1968 and say, oh, I would have marched, I would have been in the tent city, I would have stood up. But the question is, what are we quiet about right now?
And it connects right back to his point about time. If King were here today, looking at the economic disparities that still exist, the very things he was fighting in the Poor People's Campaign, he wouldn't tell us to be patient.
No, I don't think he would.
He would ask us the same question he asked then. Time is neutral. It doesn't fix things. So how are you using your time? Are you using it to preserve order or to establish justice?
And that is a question we should all be asking ourselves. From the defiance of a father in a shoe shop to the mud of Resurrection City, the lesson isn't just to admire the man, it's to continue the movement.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the man behind the monument. It's been a journey.
Always a pleasure.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive. Stay curious.